What if I told you that every single month someone walks into the wilderness of a California mountain and simply ceases to exist? Not lost, not dead, just gone, erased from reality as if they never took that final step into the trees. The tent was exactly where Carl Landers said it would be. Search and rescue arrived within hours of the distress call from his hiking partner. They found his camp undisturbed, almost serene in its ordinariness. His sleeping bag lay unzipped, the fabric still holding the shape of his body. His boots sat beside the tent entrance, placed with the careful precision of someone who intended to return. On top of his backpack, his wallet sat open, his driver's license visible through the plastic window. His car keys rested beside his phone, the screen still glowing with unread messages from worried family members. Everything suggested Carl had stepped outside for just a moment. Perhaps to relieve himself, maybe to grab something from his car. The kind of absence that lasts 30 seconds. That was 3 weeks ago. Carl Landers, a 34-year-old software engineer from Portland, has never been seen again. He vanished so completely that even the search dogs couldn't find a trail. And he's far from the first. Mount Shasta dominates the Northern California landscape like a monument to something ancient and unknowable. Rising 14,179 feet above sea level, this dormant volcano wears a crown of glaciers that gleam white against impossibly blue skies. From certain angles, the mountain doesn't look real. It looks like something an artist would paint, then discard as too dramatic, too mythical to exist in our mundane world. But Mount Shasta is very real, and so is its reputation. The native tribes who lived in its shadow for thousands of years didn't just respect this mountain. They feared it. The Wintu people called it the center of the universe, the axis point where the physical and spiritual worlds intersected. Their medicine men spoke of the Great Spirit who dwelled within its heart, a being of such power that even approaching certain areas of the mountain required elaborate rituals and offerings. The Modoc tribe told their children stories of beings from the sky who made their homes in the deep caves, emerging only when the barriers between worlds grew thin. These weren't children's fairy tales. These were survival instructions passed down through generations who had learned through devastating experience that Mount Shasta operated by rules different from the rest of the world. Modern meteorologists will tell you that Mount Shasta creates its own weather systems. The mountain's elevation and position generate localized atmospheric phenomena that baffle prediction models. Clouds materialize out of clear air. Blizzards strike without warning in the middle of summer. Temperature inversions create zones where you can be standing in freezing conditions, while someone 50 feet away sweats in summer heat. Rangers stationed at the base call Mount Shasta the most unpredictable peak in the entire Cascade Range. But weather patterns, however unusual, don't explain what happens to people here. Weather doesn't make experienced hikers vanish from marked trails in broad daylight. Weather doesn't cause children to walk away from campsites without leaving footprints. Weather doesn't make search dogs sit down and refuse to follow scents that simply stop mid-trail, as if the person they're tracking suddenly learned to fly. In 1971, the Forest Service began maintaining detailed records of search and rescue operations on Mount Shasta. These weren't casual incident reports. These were comprehensive documents that tracked every disappearance, every search effort, every outcome. The files were meant to help improve rescue protocols, to identify dangerous areas, and to save lives. What they revealed instead was a pattern so disturbing that several rangers who studied the complete records requested transfers to other mountains. Some quit the Forest Service entirely. The pattern had a name now thanks to David Paulides, a former police detective turned investigator. Paulides spent years compiling cases of missing persons from national parks and wilderness areas across North America. He identified specific characteristics that appeared again and again in cases that defied logical explanation. He called these cases Missing 411, and he discovered that Mount Shasta had more of these cases per square mile than almost anywhere else on the continent. The first documented strange disappearance that fit the Missing 401 profile occurred on May 17, 1973. It was a Thursday morning, clear and warm, the kind of spring day that makes Northern California feel like paradise. James Warden was 42 years old, a geology professor at UC Berkeley With 15 years of field experience, he wasn't some weekend hiker who'd wandered off trail. He'd led dozens of expeditions, published papers on volcanic formations, and taught wilderness survival to his graduate students. When he organized a research trip to Mount Shasta with 5 of his most advanced students, nobody worried about safety. If anyone knew how to handle themselves on a mountain, it was James Warden. They established their base camp at 8,000 feet, in a flat area near Avalanche Gulch. The location was strategic, offering easy access to the volcanic formations Warden wanted to study while providing protection from the worst weather. The first day went perfectly. They collected samples, took measurements, and documented geological features. That evening, they sat around their camp stove, discussing their findings and planning the next day's work. Warden rose before dawn on their second morning, as was his habit. One of the students, Michael Chen, heard him moving around the camp at approximately 5:45 a.m. Chen later told investigators he heard Warden humming to himself, a tuneless melody that suggested contentment. Through his tent fabric, Chen watched Warden's silhouette move past, carrying water containers toward a nearby stream. The stream was clearly visible from camp, perhaps 100 feet away through sparse pine trees. 20 minutes later, when Warden hadn't returned, the students went looking for him. They found his water containers at the stream's edge, one tipped over, water still spilling out. The container was cold to the touch, as if it had just been filled. James Warden was gone. The students searched immediately, calling his name, convinced he must have slipped and fallen somewhere nearby. They found nothing. No response to their shouts. No signs of struggle. No blood. No torn clothing. No indication that anything violent had occurred. They hiked down to the ranger station and reported their professor missing. Within 3 hours, a full search and rescue operation was underway. Within 6 hours, over 50 people were combing the mountainside. The search continued for 16 days, involving over 300 personnel, helicopters, search dogs, and even psychics that Warden's desperate wife brought in from San Francisco. They found nothing. Not a footprint leading away from the stream. Not a fiber of clothing caught on branches. Not a single trace of James Warden. The official report concluded that Warden had likely fallen and been covered by rockfall, or had somehow wandered into an area that searchers missed. But the rangers who wrote that report knew it was nonsense. They'd covered every square inch within a 5-mile radius. They'd searched caves and crevasses. They'd looked in places that would have required Warden to teleport to reach. 2 of Warden's students reported something during the search that made its way into the official files, though it was buried in an appendix that few people ever read. Both students, interviewed separately, claimed they heard Warden's voice during the search. Not once, but multiple times over several days. The voice called out from different directions, always distant, always just out of sight. When they followed the sound, they found only an empty forest. Weather records from that morning show clear skies, temperature in the low 50s, and virtually no wind. Wildlife surveys confirmed that no bears or mountain lions had been reported in the area for weeks. The stream where Warden vanished was shallow, moving slowly, impossible to drown in, even if someone had a seizure and fell face first into the water. Whatever James Warden did so in seconds, in daylight, without making a sound and without leaving any physical evidence. The geology professor, who understood mountains better than most people, understand their own neighborhoods, had simply ceased to exist. 3 years passed. The Warden case faded from public attention, though his wife never stopped searching. She hiked Mount Shasta regularly until her death in 1998, always carrying his photograph, always asking if anyone had seen him. Then it happened again. Rachel Morrison was 31 years old, a nurse at Sacramento Memorial Hospital, known for her reliability and attention to detail. The kind of person who double-checked everything, who never took unnecessary risks. In June 1976, she joined a hiking club for what was advertised as an easy day trip to Panther Meadows, one of Mount Shasta's most beautiful and most visited locations. The group numbered 12 hikers, all relatively experienced. They stayed together on the well-marked trail, maintaining a steady pace. Morrison walked in the middle of the line, chatting with the people around her about the wildflowers blooming along the path. It was early afternoon, the sun bright and warm, visibility unlimited, The trail made a switchback turn, one of those places where the path doubles back on itself to manage the slope. Tom Chen, the hiker directly behind Morrison, glanced down for perhaps 3 seconds to check his footing on the rocky section. He was maybe 10 feet behind her. When he looked up, Rachel Morrison had vanished. Chen stopped, confused. He looked ahead to where she should have been. Nothing. He turned, thinking maybe she'd somehow passed him without him noticing. Nothing. He called her name. No response. The other hikers turned back, initially annoyed at the disruption. That annoyance transformed to concern within seconds, then to panic within minutes. Morrison was simply gone. 11 people stood on an open trail with clear sightlines in every direction, and their 12th member had disappeared. They found her sunglasses on the trail, right where she'd been walking. The glasses unfolded, as if they'd fallen from her face. But there were no footprints leading off the trail. The ground around that section was soft dirt that would have shown tracks clearly. Several hikers knelt down and studied the area. The only prints were those from Morrison's hiking boots, stopping exactly where her sunglasses lay. Rangers arrived within 40 minutes. Search and rescue deployed before sunset. The search followed the same pattern as the Warden case. Extensive coverage, experienced personnel, dogs, helicopters. And the same result, nothing. But this time there were witnesses. Multiple people who experienced something during Morrison's disappearance. Tom Chen, the hiker behind her, gave a statement that troubled investigators enough that they sent him for medical evaluation. Chen reported that in those 3 seconds when he looked down, he heard a sound. He struggled to describe it. Not quite a hum, not quite a vibration. It was almost below the threshold of human hearing, felt more than heard. He said it was like standing next to a massive piece of machinery, but there was no machinery anywhere near them. Along with the sound came pressure in his ears, the kind you feel when altitude changes rapidly, or when a plane takes off. But they hadn't changed altitude. They were standing still on a flat section of trail. When Chen looked up and saw Morrison gone, the pressure released instantly. The sound stopped. Everything returned to normal, except that Rachel Morrison had been erased from existence. Chen suffered severe headaches for weeks afterward. Doctors found nothing wrong with him physically, but he reported feeling like something had changed inside his head. He described it as having a radio that occasionally picked up stations that shouldn't exist. Sometimes in the twilight between waking and sleeping, he said he could hear voices speaking in harmonies that human vocal cords couldn't produce. But Chen wasn't alone in his experience. Margaret Wells, who had been walking 2 positions ahead of Morrison, gave a statement that was even more disturbing. Wells claimed that for just a moment, for less than a second, the forest around her seemed to flicker. She used that word specifically, flicker. Like reality was a film reel that had momentarily stuck. In that instant of distortion, Wells saw something else where the forest should have been. She described tall structures that looked like they were made of crystal or glass, catching light in ways that hurt to look at directly. The structures were massive, extending upward beyond her field of vision. And she saw figures moving among these structures, tall, slender figures that moved with unsettling fluidity. Then reality snapped back. The trees returned. The crystal structures vanished. And Rachel Morrison was gone. Wells never hiked Mount Shasta again. She moved to Arizona the following year and refused to discuss the incident with anyone except the investigators. Her written statement was filed away, marked as potential stress-induced hallucination, and largely ignored. The disappearances continued through the late 1970s and into the 1980s. Not frequently enough to make national news, but regularly enough that locals began to notice. Campfire conversations in Mount Shasta City turned dark. Parents warned their children about certain areas. Experienced guides quietly refused to take clients to specific locations on the mountain, citing vague concerns about bad energy or unstable terrain. The Forest Service maintained its public position that all disappearances had rational explanations. But privately, rangers were keeping their own records, unofficial logs that documented phenomena that would sound insane in official reports. These logs were handwritten, passed between trusted colleagues, never entered into computer systems. One of these logs eventually leaked in 1987, photocopied by a ranger who decided the public had a right to know what was happening on their mountain. The log described an incident that had never been made public, an encounter experienced by Ranger Patricia Hoffman during a routine patrol. Hoffman was an experienced ranger, 15 years on Mount Shasta, someone who knew every trail and every trick the mountain could play. On a clear afternoon in August 1986, she was conducting a standard patrol near Horse Camp when reality broke. That's how she described it in her log entry. Reality broke. The forest in front of her appeared to fold in on itself, trees bent at impossible angles without making sounds of breaking wood. The ground seemed to ripple like water. And through this distortion, Hoffman glimpsed something that shouldn't exist. She saw a vast chamber, impossibly large to fit inside the mountain. The walls glowed with soft blue light that had no apparent source. The chamber extended in multiple directions that didn't correspond to normal three-dimensional space. It hurt her eyes to look at, but she couldn't look away. Inside the chamber, she saw people, or things that looked like people. Tall figures, perhaps 8 feet in height, wearing garments that seemed to be made of light itself. They moved through the chamber in patterns that suggested purpose, like they were performing some kind of work or ritual. Hoffman heard voices, multiple voices speaking in perfect harmony, creating sounds that felt ancient and alien. The words, if they were words, bypassed her ears entirely. She understood their meaning directly in her mind. They were discussing something about thin places and crossing times and preparations that needed to be made. The event lasted 12 seconds by Hoffman's watch, though she would have sworn it lasted much longer. When reality snapped back into its normal configuration, Hoffman found herself standing 50 feet from where she'd started, facing the opposite direction. She had no memory of moving. Her compass spun wildly for hours afterward, the needle rotating continuously without settling on any direction. Her radio produced only static, but it was strange static, forming patterns that almost sounded like language or music. When she finally re-established contact with the ranger station, she discovered that 4 hours had passed. To Hoffman, perhaps 30 minutes had elapsed. She filed a formal report about the incident, but it was returned to her by her supervisor with a note suggesting she take some personal time and perhaps see a doctor. Hoffman tried to push the issue, but was warned that continued insistence on what clearly seemed like a hallucination or mental health episode might affect her career. 2 weeks later, Patricia Hoffman resigned from the Forest Service. She moved to Florida, as far from mountains as she could get. In her resignation letter, she wrote only, "I cannot work on a mountain that isn't entirely part of our world." September 1989 brought the case that finally attracted serious attention from outside investigators, not because the disappearance was more mysterious than others, but because the victim was a child, and because the circumstances were so impossible to explain away. Tommy Brennan was 8 years old, the kind of energetic, happy kid that every family gathering revolves around. His extended family, 43 relatives in total, had gathered at Sand Flat Campground for their annual Labor Day reunion. It was tradition, going back 3 generations. The Brennans had been coming to this same campground for over 30 years without incident. The afternoon was warm and perfect. Children played while adults prepared dinner. Tommy's mother, Susan Brennan, was no more than 20 feet away from him. She could see him clearly, playing with his cousins, throwing pine cones at a tree and keeping score of who hit the target most often. Susan turned to speak with her sister for perhaps 10 seconds. She looked back to check on Tommy, as mothers do 100 times a day. He was gone. The panic was immediate. 43 people dropped everything and spread through the campground, calling Tommy's name. They searched with the kind of desperate intensity that only family members can bring. Within 5 minutes, every inch of the immediate area had been covered. They found one of Tommy's shoes at the edge of the clearing. It sat upright in the dirt, laces still tied as if someone had carefully placed it there. But there were no footprints leading away from the shoe. None. The ground was soft dirt and pine needles, perfect for showing tracks. Yet there were no marks suggesting anyone or anything had walked through that area. Rangers were notified immediately. Search and rescue deployed within 2 hours, bringing their best tracking dogs. The dogs picked up Tommy's scent at his shoe, followed it in a tight circle 3 times, then sat down and refused to continue. The handlers tried everything to get the dogs to search. The animals simply wouldn't do it. Both dogs showed signs of extreme distress, whimpering and pulling away from the area. A second team of dogs was brought in, thinking maybe the first team had been poorly trained or off their game. The second team reacted identically. They followed the scent in a circle, then refused to go further, showing the same anxiety and fear. The search expanded over the next 5 days. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras scanned from above. Over 500 volunteers formed grid patterns and swept through the forest. Cave rescue specialists explored every known opening in the mountain. They found nothing beyond that single shoe, carefully placed in the dirt. On the 6th day, something happened that investigators tried to suppress but couldn't keep quiet. A local newspaper reporter was interviewing the Brennan family, documenting their grief and frustration. The reporter noticed Tommy's 7-year-old cousin, Lisa, sitting alone at a picnic table drawing pictures. The reporter, a woman named Angela Martinez, went over to speak with Lisa, thinking maybe a human interest angle about how children process trauma. She glanced at Lisa's drawings and stopped cold. Lisa had drawn a small boy surrounded by tall figures in white. The figures were much taller than the boy, with elongated bodies and smooth, featureless faces. Around them, Lisa had drawn what looked like doorways hanging in empty space. In the pictures, the tall figures were leading the small boy through one of these doorways. Martinez asked Lisa about the drawings. The child, speaking with the matter-of-fact clarity that young children sometimes have about impossible things, said, "That's Tommy. The white people came from inside the mountain, and he went with them. They opened a door in the air and they all walked through." Martinez felt chills run down her spine. She asked Lisa if she'd actually seen this happen. Lisa nodded, then pointed to 3 other children sitting near their parents. "They saw it too," she said. Against her better journalistic judgment, Martinez interviewed the other children. Away from their parents, speaking in quiet voices, all 3 described the same event. Tall figures in white clothing had appeared near the tree line. They'd moved without sound, without disturbing the pine needles on the ground. One of them had gestured to Tommy, who'd stopped playing and walked toward them. The figures had done something, made a gesture or spoken words the children couldn't hear, and the air had opened. A doorway had appeared where no doorway should exist. Tommy and the figures had walked through, and the doorway had closed. The adults dismissed this as a trauma response, as children created a shared fantasy to process something frightening. Child psychologists were brought in to interview the young witnesses. The psychologists found the children's stories remarkably consistent, detailed, and delivered with none of the usual markers of fabrication. The children weren't embellishing or contradicting each other. They were reporting what they believed they'd seen with absolute conviction. None of the adults at the reunion had seen anything unusual. But all the children under age 10 described the tall figures in white. Every single one. Tommy Brennan was never found. His case file remains open, though active searching stopped after 3 months. The Brennan family still maintains a memorial at Sand Flat Campground, returning every Labor Day to mark the anniversary of his disappearance. Lisa Brennan grew up haunted by what she'd witnessed. As an adult, she became a researcher specializing in childhood anomalous experiences. Her work has documented hundreds of cases worldwide where children report seeing beings, structures, and events that adults cannot perceive. Her theory, controversial but backed by intriguing data, suggests that young minds might perceive broader spectrums of reality, spectrums that mature brains learn to filter out as part of normal development. The Tommy Brennan case marked a turning point. Families of the missing began connecting with each other, comparing experiences, discovering parallels that official reports had overlooked or ignored. They found that many disappearances occurred during geomagnetic storms. They noticed that witnesses frequently reported electronics malfunctioning around the time of vanishings, compasses spinning wildly, camera batteries drained instantly despite being fully charged, cell phones displaying GPS coordinates that placed them in impossible locations, sometimes showing elevations below sea level or coordinates in the middle of the ocean. Keith Wolverton, a systems analyst from Portland with a background in data science, became obsessed with these patterns. In 1991, he started compiling a comprehensive database of Mount Shasta disappearances, cross-referencing them with weather data, geological surveys, astronomical events, and witness statements. His findings disturbed him enough that he took a leave of absence from his job to investigate full-time. Wolverton discovered that disappearances clustered around specific locations on the mountain. These weren't random distributions. The clustering was statistically significant, suggesting that certain areas were genuinely more dangerous than others. He overlaid his disappearance map with geological survey data from the USGS and found something remarkable. The disappearance clusters corresponded almost perfectly with magnetic anomalies that had been documented by government geologists. These were areas where the Earth's magnetic field behaved strangely, showing fluctuations and intensities that didn't match surrounding terrain. Then Wolverton made an even stranger connection. He compared his map with anthropological records of areas that Native American tribes had forbidden their members to enter. The forbidden zones matched the disappearance clusters and the magnetic anomalies almost exactly. Ancient peoples had identified these dangerous areas centuries before modern instruments could measure anything unusual about them. Wolverton became convinced he was looking at evidence of something operating in specific geographic locations, something that had been present for a very long time. He decided he needed to investigate firsthand. In August 1994, Wolverton equipped himself with magnetometers, radiation detectors, and extensive recording equipment. He chose the Pluto Caves area, a section of Mount Shasta that had seen 7 unexplained disappearances since 1975. He planned to spend 3 days camping in the area, taking measurements, documenting any anomalies he could detect. He never completed his 3-day study, but he left behind a journal that raised more questions than it answered. Wolverton's journal, found inside his tent 5 days after he failed to check in with his emergency contact, described increasingly strange phenomena. His instruments detected massive electromagnetic fluctuations beginning on his second night. His compass needles spun continuously, never settling on north. His radio produced static that formed patterns, almost like language or music, repeating in sequences that suggested meaning. At 11:47 p.m. on his second night, all of Wolverton's electronic equipment failed simultaneously. In the darkness, with no artificial light, he reported seeing illumination approaching through the trees. But it wasn't normal light. It didn't cast shadows. It didn't illuminate the surrounding forest. It simply existed, a sphere of luminance moving toward his position. Wolverton's handwriting became increasingly erratic as his final entry progressed. He described the light resolving into a doorway suspended in the air, rectangular and impossibly smooth-edged. Through this doorway, he could see a corridor extending far beyond what should have been possible, given the mountain's topology. The corridor's walls appeared to be made of polished stone or metal, glowing with that same sourceless light. Wolverton wrote about feeling an overwhelming compulsion to enter the doorway. Not desire, compulsion, as if his body wanted to move forward independent of his will. He described fighting the urge, physically forcing himself to stumble backward toward his tent. Once inside, he wrote frantically by flashlight, his words tumbling over each other in urgency. His final entry read, "They're calling me back. I can hear them in my head. Not words, but pure meaning. They say I've seen too much. They say I can choose, go with them or forget everything. I don't want to forget, but I can already feel my memories starting to fade like waking from a dream. If someone finds this journal, know that the doors are real. The mountain is hollow. Time moves differently inside. I'm going back to the light. I have to know what this is. I have to understand." When rangers found Wolverton's campsite, everything appeared completely normal. His tent was zipped shut from the inside. His sleeping bag was laid out but showed no signs of use. All his equipment was neatly arranged and functioning perfectly. The instruments that had allegedly failed were working without issue. Keith Wolverton had vanished, leaving only his journal and a mystery that would consume researchers for decades. The Forest Service classified Wolverton's journal as evidence in an ongoing investigation, which meant it shouldn't have been released to the public. But copies leaked, as sensitive documents always do. Researchers who studied the journal found details that shouldn't have been possible. Wolverton had sketched diagrams of the doorway he'd seen. His drawings matched almost line for line. Sketches made by Dennis Martin, a hiker who'd disappeared in 1969. Martin's notebook had been found a year after his vanishing, tucked into a crevasse miles from where he'd last been seen. Martin had drawn the same rectangular doorway, the same smooth edges, the same sense of depth extending beyond natural possibility. Most disturbing were the symbols both men had drawn around their doorway illustrations. Neither man had any background in linguistics or ancient languages, yet both had reproduced identical symbols, complex geometric patterns, mixed with something that looked almost like writing but matched no known human script. These symbols were sent to linguists and cryptographers at several universities. None could identify their origin, but Dr. Marcus Chen at Stanford noticed something unsettling. When he ran the symbols through pattern recognition software, the program began behaving erratically. It crashed repeatedly. When IT technicians examined the code, they discovered that the software had begun generating its own symbols, filling terabytes of storage with an evolving language that built upon itself in increasingly complex iterations. The symbols seemed to be instructions or seed code for something, but what they were instructing or coding remained unknown. Stanford quietly shut down that research project after the symbol-generating software began affecting other systems on the university network. As the 1990s progressed into the 2000s, the phenomenon showed no signs of stopping. If anything, it was accelerating. The disappearances came more frequently. More witnesses reported strange experiences. More evidence accumulated of something profoundly wrong with Mount Shasta. In 2001, Dr. Sarah Collins, a folklore professor at UC Davis, began comprehensive research into Native American accounts of Mount Shasta. She spent 3 years interviewing tribal elders, translating old stories, piecing together oral histories that stretched back centuries before European contact. What she discovered suggested that the modern disappearances were nothing new. Native tribes had been losing people to Mount Shasta for as long as anyone could remember, but they developed protocols, rituals, and traditions to minimize the losses. They understood in ways that modern science couldn't yet explain that Mount Shasta was a threshold place, somewhere that existed partially in this world and partially in another. Mary Northwind, a Wintu elder, granted Collins an extensive interview in 2003. Northwind's grandfather had been a medicine man who knew the old protections, the rituals that could keep travelers anchored to this world, even when walking through the mountain's thin places. But these rituals were complex, requiring specific knowledge and preparation. Without them, people who entered certain areas could slip between worlds. Northwind explained that some who crossed over returned, but they were changed. They carried knowledge they shouldn't possess. They aged differently. They perceived reality in ways that marked them as no longer entirely human. Most who crossed never returned at all, existing now in places that human language couldn't properly describe. According to Northwind, the beings inside Mount Shasta weren't malevolent or benevolent. They simply operated according to different physics, different rules of existence. When humans accidentally crossed into their realm, human bodies and minds became subject to laws that weren't designed for human consciousness. Some adapted, others broke. Many simply ceased to exist in any way that made sense from a human perspective. That same year, 2 experienced climbers had an encounter that seemed to validate Northwind's claims. Marcus Webb and Janet Ling were descending from the summit when fog rolled in with that sudden completeness that Mount Shasta specializes in. Rather than risk navigation errors, they decided to wait out the weather. While huddled against a rock formation, both heard footsteps circling their position. Heavy footsteps crunching through snow and ice. But visibility was near zero. They saw nothing. Webb pulled out his camera, intending to document the fog conditions. Looking through the viewfinder, which sometimes cuts through atmospheric distortion better than the naked eye, he saw figures walking past their position. The figures were roughly humanoid in shape, but stood nearly 8 feet tall. Their bodies seemed to shimmer, as if they weren't entirely solid or were phasing in and out of full materialization. They moved through the fog in a processional line, walking with purpose towards some destination Webb couldn't see. He took 17 photographs before his camera malfunctioned, the battery dying despite being fully charged moments before. When the photos were later developed, they showed only fog, but enhanced analysis revealed anomalous heat signatures in humanoid shapes, showing thermal readings that didn't match any known animal or environmental effect. Both climbers reported feeling an intense compulsion to follow the figures. Ling described it as the strongest urge she'd ever experienced, stronger than hunger or thirst or fear. Only by physically holding onto each other did they resist the pull. They gripped each other's jackets and forced themselves to remain in place while the footsteps circled them for 40 minutes. When the fog finally cleared, Webb and Ling found themselves surrounded by footprints that led in a circle around their position, then simply stopped. The prints themselves defied explanation. Each measured 18 inches long with a stride length, suggesting beings over 7 feet tall. But the prints showed no anatomical detail. No toe marks, no heel strikes, no indication of natural foot structure. They looked pressed into the snow as if by flat templates. Similar prints had been photographed on Mount Shasta since the 1960s. They didn't match any known animal. Cryptozoologists had examined casts and determined they weren't consistent with theoretical Bigfoot prints, which show primate anatomy. These prints suggested something else entirely, something that didn't walk the way biological organisms walk. The pattern continued. People vanished. Witnesses reported impossibilities. Evidence accumulated. And the official response remained unchanged. Nothing unusual was happening on Mount Shasta. But that response became harder to maintain after 2003, when Robert Daniels disappeared and then reappeared. Forever changed. Daniels was a software engineer from San Jose, 37 years old, described by friends as methodical and rational. He went camping with 3 friends near Bunny Flat in October 2003. On their second night, Daniels left the tent around midnight to urinate. His friends heard him unzip the tent, step outside and walk a few feet away. They never heard him return. In the morning, they found his sleeping bag empty. His boots were still inside the tent. His coat hung on a hook. Daniels had walked into a freezing mountain night, wearing only thermal underwear and wool socks. The search followed the now familiar pattern. Extensive coverage, no results. Daniels had vanished completely. His friends were devastated. His family held a memorial service. Life moved on without Robert Daniels. 3 days after the service, Daniels walked out of the forest 5 miles from where he'd disappeared. He was unharmed, showing no signs of exposure despite nighttime temperatures that had dropped below freezing. His thermal underwear and socks were clean and dry. He wasn't hungry or thirsty. He was, in every physical measure, perfectly fine. But Robert Daniels was no longer entirely Robert Daniels. He had no memory of the missing 3 days. Medical examination revealed no signs of exposure, dehydration, or malnutrition. Brain scans showed unusual activity in his temporal lobes, patterns typically associated with temporal lobe epilepsy, though Daniels had no history of seizures or neurological issues. Over the following weeks, Daniels experienced what he described as downloads of information. He would wake from sleep with overwhelming urges to write or draw. He filled notebooks with complex mathematical equations he couldn't explain or even fully understand. He drew diagrams of machines whose purpose he couldn't articulate. He created star charts for constellations not visible from Earth. He wrote in languages he didn't recognize. Linguists who examined his notebooks identified fragments resembling ancient Sumerian and Proto-Sanskrit scripts, but much of what Daniels wrote matched no known language system. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a theoretical physicist at Caltech, heard about Daniels through colleagues and requested access to his mathematical work. What she found shocked her. Daniels, who had no background in advanced physics, had produced equations that described quantum field theory at levels beyond current human understanding. One equation appeared to outline a method for folding spacetime without requiring exotic matter, solving one of the major obstacles to practical, faster-than-light travel. Another described what might be a communication system using quantum entanglement across parallel dimensions. Tanaka tried to work with Daniels to understand where this knowledge came from, but Daniels himself didn't know. He just wrote what came to him, transcribing information that seemed to download directly into his consciousness. 6 months after his return, Robert Daniels disappeared again. This time he left a note in his apartment. "The door is open. They showed me what's coming. I have work to do on the other side." Security cameras in his apartment complex recorded Daniels walking into the parking garage at 2:47 a.m. He never emerged. His car remained in its space. Every exit was covered by cameras, and he appeared in none of the footage. Robert Daniels had walked into a parking garage and ceased to exist in our world. The cases continue year after year, each adding new layers to the mystery. The mountain keeps taking people. The doors keep opening. And we keep searching for explanations that make sense within the bounds of physics and reality as we understand them. But maybe that's the problem. Maybe Mount Shasta operates by rules we haven't discovered yet. Maybe there are doors in our world that lead to places human science can't yet measure or describe. Maybe some people accidentally step through these doors. And maybe what's on the other side is so different from our reality that returning becomes impossible. Or maybe there's something inside Mount Shasta that's been here far longer than humans, something that occasionally reaches out and takes what it needs for purposes we cannot comprehend. The families of the missing continue their vigils. They return to the mountain, hoping for some sign, some message, some miracle that will bring their loved ones home. Some report dreams where the vanished speak to them, describing cities inside the mountain and beings who exist outside linear time. The Forest Service maintains that everything has rational explanations, but the rangers who work the mountain know better. They see the patterns, they hear the stories, and late at night, when they're alone on patrol and the mountain begins its ancient singing, they wonder what walks these forests alongside them. Mount Shasta rises against the northern California sky, beautiful and terrible in its mystery. The glaciers gleam, the forests whisper, and somewhere within that wilderness, doorways wait for the next person who will step through and disappear into legend. The missing call out from places we cannot reach. And the mountain keeps its secrets, as it has for thousands of years, as it will for thousands more. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Some doors once opened can never be closed. And some truths are too vast and terrible for human minds to safely contain. Mount Shasta waits. The doors remain. And the disappearances continue.